Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the theme of heaven in relation to Tammy Faye. And I mean, this is a kind of an idea that's come up over the last few years for me in terms of my work. I work a lot with this philosopher called Peter Rollins, same surname as me. And his work is to do with like a form of theology, but it's not necessarily like to do with confessional religion, but more to do with how humans have this propensity to believe and how this propensity to believe like affects our life and affects the way that we live, and then how to sort of come to terms with that and live well in relation to that. And we made a film a couple of years ago, and it was a film actually based on a few films that I'd made. So a lot of the work that I do is like a filmmaker. It wasn't like intending to be like this, but it ended up being like this. It's sort of, I do often like narrative films that are around a philosophical idea. So it's not like they're parables, although parables tend to be, narrative stories around a sort of key idea that it's trying to put it across explicitly. Whereas I think my stuff is more to do with impossibility and contradiction as a theme. So it's not like saying something explicit, but like it's around this idea, and it's sort of having these ideas sort of play out within a story. And we took three of the films I made and then like did a sort of like analysis, philosophical analysis of it, in terms of like how the characters desire and how this relates to sort of desire as a philosophical subject. And we decided to end the film with the Belinda Carlisle song, Heaven is a Place on Earth, right? Because I
Yes.
think actually like the end point of Pete and my colleagues' work is this idea of living, making the most of life while you have it, and how we can miss the rich complexity of life because of some of the ways that we believe. Not that there's any problem with belief at all, but that sometimes we allow certain impulses that are natural to being human to dominate our life and to take away the fact that maybe heaven is in existence with other people,
Yeah.
in making the most of life, in community, and that kind of thing. And I think that like Tammy's very earthy kind of theology and the way she was in the world relates to this. And that's not to say that like life is easy. And I think Tammy found life quite difficult in many ways, but it's really sort of throwing yourself into that complexity. And for instance, she really related to people, and being in community with people is very difficult. And I think that in a sort of very sanitized world, we're all kind of afraid of each other when we interact only mediated through screens. We're not really proximate to people, but that misses this kind of aspect of heaven in terms of a relationship, like what really makes life meaningful. But
Yeah.
that positive aspect always comes with a downside. And funnily
Mm.
enough, I was thinking about it again this week because I just did a music project, sort of the film work for a music project, with somebody I work with quite a lot, who's a Mexican singer called Jesus Adrian Romero, and he has sort of like a spiritual bent to his work. And actually, the song that we were working on was is coming out soon, is to do with this idea of, in his case, talking about like religious people being so obsessed with heaven that they miss life and interactions with other people, conviviality, living in the moment. um and life isn't easy, and potentially what makes life beautiful is its darkness, is its complexity, is its contradiction. um and that we can sometimes be a bit cowardly in our interactions with life and then miss out on what is really beautiful and powerful and meaningful in life. And so I just thought it was interesting because we were thinking about a theme to talk about with Tammy, and I think it's a something that really relates to Tammy's theology, but also for me personally, I feel like it's come up quite a lot as an idea in my own life recently.
Yeah, that's really good. One of the things that comes up for me real quick is if in Sartre's philosophy, he says
Mm-hmm.
that hell is other people, maybe in
Right.
Tammy Faye's radical theology, heaven is other people.
But you can't,
Yeah.
maybe, the notion of heaven is only meaningful in relation to hell. Like, so light, you only
Absolutely.
have light because of dark. You only have a word that means something because there's no sound. That there's, if you have a word on a page, it's like the word starts with white space before it and ends with white space out. So you have the contrast, and it's like the opposite that makes the thing. So it's interesting that Sartre was like, hell is other people, but maybe heaven is other people, but that doesn't mean it's easy or all roses and candy floss and kittens and everything.
Exactly.
Did you say candy frost?
Candy floss. You call it
Oh,
what do you
candy
call it in America?
floss.
You call it
Candy floss. I'd like to see
what do you call it in
that.
America
My kids
again?
would like that.
Cotton
floss with the
cotton
candy?
candy. Cotton candy.
Oh, cotton candy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because my mom used to say, it's a nice American accent.
Yeah,
My
I'm
mom used to
impressed.
say, you know, you're so heavenly minded. She used to tell me that some people are so heavenly minded they're no earthly good.
Mm.
And that was like, I found out later, like there was a song like that said that, you know, there was all these sayings that, you know, my mom listened to a lot of country music when she was going through hard times in I think her 30s. But and it's true, you know, she's like, there's so many people who are focused on the, you know, and I think we just see this all the time with, you know, you hear about Christians who like, well, they don't care about the planet or they don't care about this, you know, because they're all thinking about getting to heaven. So they're so heavenly minded, they're no earthly good. And I think one of the things that my mom always kind of focused on was living in the present, living in the now.
Mm.
And even in her sickness, you know, it was like she tried to live in the present and not like she didn't want to die. You know what I mean? She didn't want to be in heaven until it was time to go there. You know what I mean? And I believe she believed in it, you know, but I think she believed that we are supposed to make it kind of like, which would be more theologically sound, is that, you know, like it's on earth, you know, and that we're trying to make life a little bit of a less of a hell, you know, and make it a better place. And I think she understood that life could, you know, could be very much be hell, you know.
Yeah. So Jay, I know you're like the theologian and the biblical scholar in the group. You know, right, when Jesus talks about eternal life, you know, my understanding of that is that it wasn't necessarily, you know, somewhere in the sky or even in the future. It was about the quality of life in the here and now. And I don't even think that has to be idealistic, right? There's the muck and the mire within that as well, as you're talking about, Tammy. But maybe, or Tammy, that's a good Freudian slip. Helen. Isn't that what Tammy was about? Was kind of this full life, the good and the bad, heaven here on earth in some ways.
Definitely. I mean, I would say definitely. I mean, you know, that was the thing about the kingdom of God, is everybody was going like, oh, you know, and when Jesus would talk about that. And that's the thing that like, even like when a lot of people get wrong, they think the kingdom of God is heaven. And it is supposedly, it's an earthly realm where God, you know, so the idea is that it's, you know, I think that's kind of what my parents were trying to do with Heritage USA, was just kind of create a place that people could come and let the burdens of life, put your burdens down for a little while, you know, and come here and you know, and relax and get away from that. And that, you know, society kind of, and it's so funny because you have all these people who are like, you know, don't like Christians, and then they get mad at Christians when they decide to have fun. You know, I'm like, oh, Christians, oh, well, Christians shouldn't have water parks, you know. And they're like, we don't like Christians because they're so judgmental. And then all of a sudden Christians have a water park and, you know, TV shows, and like, oh, then they become the judgmental ones, because then they become like the rulers of like what Christians should be and shouldn't be. You know, they all think, you know, well, you should be in like, you know, Mother Teresa. That's what a Christian is, not a, you know, and I'd say she's a great example, of course, but, you know, but I think there's, you know, life is complicated, needs a lot of things. And in America, you know, we're consumed by capitalism and working hard, that my parents thought like, well, you know, a lot of humans here, you know, yeah, we're going to feed the poor and help them too, but there's also a lot of middle-class people who just need a damn break, you know, to get away and enjoy themselves, and know that it's okay to be, you know, a follower of Jesus and, you know, take a vacation, you know, and you can still worship Jesus on vacation. So it's kind of silly. I mean, it seems silly, but I think in their eyes, it was just like, if God is what God claims to be, if Jesus is what Jesus is supposed to be, shouldn't every aspect of our lives be taken care of? It's really a funny thing to look back on, but I just remember they used to do these commercials for Heritage USA, and everybody would be like, it's a little bit of heaven, a little glimpse of heaven, you know, and that was like the key line, you know. So yeah, I think, you know, yeah, Mom definitely believed in making people comfortable and giving people peace, and but she could also turn hell into heaven, you know, like she really could. Like she really took a lot of dark moments in my life and other people's lives, and like, you know, people who are angry and like and judgmental and would like just come and like attack her. She would just disarm them, you know, and take them to dinner, you know, or have a laugh with them, or give them a hug, or, you know, sign their I Ran Into Tammy Faye, you know, shirts, or like, you know, with my buddy who said, oh, I'd love to have your mom tattoo me. I brought my mom in one day, and my mom literally tattooed my tattoo artist. But she went above that. Like she went and she's like, oh, I'll put a picture in a frame. She put a picture in her frame, and then she pulled out her crazy glue and started crazy gluing her makeup onto the frame, like literally makeup that she had used, you know, and put it on there because she wanted people to feel special and loved, and she liked doing things for people. And that was what was really cool, is to kind of see that, like, you know, just that goes far, you know. I mean, you're a therapist, you understand that. Like when people get when people are felt seen and felt special and felt like, oh,
I think it makes all the difference. And and you know, not to get on my own hobby horse, but I think it's so lacking nowadays because of so much of the digital communication, and just, you know, from my vantage point, just a lot of bullying and meanness and hatred. A lot of people aren't seen. They might be watched, but they're not seen, and that's so key.
But this is, you know, we were talking about this a lot last time in terms of recognition and how important it is to understand that to be seen is quite risky, because it involves a real person. So obviously there's a dynamic when it's just through a screen, where throughout the history of sort of screen media and movies and stuff, we don't relate to screen images the same we relate to like people in real life. Screen images are for, you know, movie stars and superior beings who maybe are judging us, or kind of, you know, advertisements and things like that, who are telling us to desire certain things. But actual recognition comes from being seen in the eyes of somebody who is a person who has the ability to choose and to discern. And if somebody has the ability to choose and discern, and maybe this is the hell as other people thing, there comes this risk that maybe they won't like us. But we can only be like the flavor or the positive of somebody coming to like us is only possible because they have the possibility to not like us. So that involves the kind of risk. But I was also thinking, Jay, about your point with the sort of judgmentalism of Christians, and then this judgmentalism of the judgmentalism of Christians, right? So basically there is this idea, like somebody said this phrase, which sounds a bit kind of crazy, maybe a bit cliche, but it really hit me when it was said to me several years ago, which is often what you think other people think of you is what you think of yourself. So this is to do with like transference and all this kind of stuff, which obviously is to do with therapy and to do with like psychoanalysis. But like there is this role that sometimes in society people project onto other groups, you know, a sense of judgmentalism, but maybe that's how they feel about themselves. So when they say, oh, well, Christians can't have fun, which is the like judgmental of the judgmentalism, is maybe because they think that Christians are judging them for having fun, which maybe they think that they shouldn't be having fun, but they think that the Christians, you know, what the Christians are judging them for is actually what they think of themselves.
Yeah, the Christians are right. We shouldn't be having fun. Now they're having fun.
How dare they? So it's always like so much and this is why it's so important. And like I think social media is so bad for this, but it's so important to like see people as people and to have these, like, I think a philosophical understanding of subjectivity is really missing. And this is something that, like, you know, not all aspects of religion are positive, you know, but not all aspects of religion are negative. And I think in some ways throughout history, religions were like an attempt to do philosophy for the people. So to help people understand, you know, ways that might because life is not like binary.
Mm.
It's full of contradictions. It's full
Yes.
of, the chaos of light and dark, and there's things that really don't make sense. And this, though, I do think is very scientifically explicable and very like philosophically explicable in terms of, if you understand, it's kind of a long thing to get into, but like the Big Bang, for instance, if you believe in the Big Bang, which, is a scientific credible theory, is to do with that our whole universe was only possible because of this sort of contradiction between light and dark, between positive and negative, that at a certain point things become, matter became so crunched together. Excuse me, physics people, because I'm probably just
So crushed
it becomes
together.
its opposite. So our
Yeah.
whole, and expand. So our whole universe is marked by this like positive and negative, light and dark contradiction. And so what religion has historically done, even though there are some like doctrines that are maybe bad and legalisms that's maybe bad, but like there are aspects to all religions which are ways to try to make people come to terms with the things that are difficult to come to terms with, which is like the contradiction of the universe. But I do think philosophy can get us to do that as well, sort of outside of religion.
Yes.
But we have like, in terms of like the judgmentalism of the imagined potentially judgmental Christians, it's like often like a snobbery to do with like what that set of ideas can do for people, because it seems like, well, it's not logical, therefore it's wrong. But actually, to be logical, you have to be able to tolerate things that are apparently illogical, including other people. And I think what's really missing today is this understanding of subjectivity, which is very, very messy, very, very contradictory. We're marked by something called the unconscious, which is something that completely doesn't make sense. It's like the cut across reality that just like means that everything is possible and nothing is possible. And if we only think in this binary way, which I think like social media encourages us to do, that seeing people as objects and commodities, we don't really see people as people, and we miss so much. And we might sanitize the more difficult aspects of people, like the discernment. They might be able to say that they don't like us or they do like us, but actually, really, I think we're missing a trick in terms of what is heaven and other people.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that Tammy was like so, and I think this is one of the things that makes her such an attractive person, is we know that we're in this sort of epoch of oppositional thinking, of isolation. And someone like Tammy was sort of this like almost Christ-like figure that bore the burden of being the person who reached out, of being the person who said the opposite, at any time. I mean,
She
like
risked.
she risked, and she maybe like whatever system you have, because we live in a complex and contradictory universe, we can rarely capture the totality of reality if we live by a set of doctrines. And even if these doctrines are like trying their best to be complex or whatever, there's always going to be someone missing and something missing. And Tammy was the person in Christianity at that time who reached out, who pointed to the contradiction in the set of beliefs. And it's very, very risky to do that, because people generally and understandably want an easier life, and it's easier to live by sort of binary oppositional systems of thought. But Tammy was that person who was able to sort of transcend that way of thinking and to reach out to people, because with that way of thinking, there's always going to be somebody who's cast out from the group. So Tammy was like identified with the outsider. And I think really that's, I think getting to that point of like heaven in terms of human interaction involves that.
And and it's weird, because I also sometimes think that sometimes she got there out of I don't want to say that she was naive, because I do, the more I like, funny is like, I knew my mother obviously, but the more I've read her books, the more I realized like she was not naive at all.
Right.
Like she knew what was going on. But or at least sometimes she played it naive, to be able to walk it. And I mean that was kind of her superpower, was how she was able to walk through to these different worlds. Because honestly, like the work I'm doing, I'm trying, like she's literally one of my heroes in my work, which is so bizarre, and trying to create this space that's not a safe space, but a space where people can come together with diverse thoughts, like conservatives and liberals and people in the middle, and all these people, atheists and Christians and blah, blah, all come together and just have conversations and have hard conversations. Where my mom was able to do it in a way where she may have been the butt of jokes, but she wasn't seen as like the bad guy twisting their mustache, you know? And I feel like when I try to do it, like, I feel like I'm constantly seen like somehow as like the fly in the peanut butter. You know what I mean? It's like,
that's how I see you. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Well, no,
Fly
I
in the
get
peanut
Christians mad at me. I get conservative Christians mad at me. I get liberal Christians mad. Like, I get non-Christians. Like, they're all pissed. Like, I'm like, no, my mom came in, everybody was like, oh, Tammy, you know, and I'm coming in and everybody's like, what is this guy up to? You know, I'm like, I just literally trying to do what my mom did. And I want you guys all to have this conversation. But everybody's kind of like I was just talking to these folks who like run this ex-Christian website and all this stuff. And they were, and I said, hey, listen, you know, I was on my Revolution account, so I don't think they knew who I was. And I was like, you know, hey, my mom's funeral was protested by the Westboro Baptists, blah, blah, blah. You know, I know what you're talking about. But I put this post up about these Nazi Christians. And I'm like, but most Christians aren't Nazis. And I think even even really conservative Christians would agree that this is wrong, you know, and they were arguing that. But they just went on the attack, you know? And it was like this weird thing, because I feel like if we were in person, we would probably agree on like 90% of the same stuff. We would agree. But here we are online, and maybe because the word church was there, and maybe because I was saying like, hey, not everybody's this way. You know, it's just this idea that there's no longer this room to have contradictions or to have conflict, you know, and everybody's so afraid of conflict that they just automatically become angry and hurt and jump onto the other person. And my mother had a way of disarming that, you know, and I know it's all supposed to be about heaven, but I feel like, you know, if we want earth to be less hell, if we want life to be less hell, we're going to have to learn how to not automatically discount people who don't agree with us or think differently than us. You know, there's got to be a way where we can create a thing where we're able to have conversations. And I think her gift was knowing how to disarm folks like that and just love folks like that. And I think maybe her limited education, you know, but at the same time, her deeper understanding kind of helped that, because she didn't get into philosophy. She didn't get into, you know, a theological discussion. She would just be like, well, baby, at least they can't eat you, you know, or something like that. And it would just be like disarmed. And maybe sometimes we're you know, we're forgetting the more just instinctive ways of disarming each other rather than trying to prove her point.
Totally. I mean, this makes me think a little bit about like it's funny because when you talk about the word political, this often gets like people's guard up. But I actually think because what we see as politics today really is the antithesis of politics. Like most quote unquote politics or party politics today prevents politics from happening. Because I actually think about like, you know, we've had this fourth industrial revolution, right? And I think we've got to the stage, every time we have an industrial revolution under capitalism, it seems like we forget the basic functionings. So even like an extremely conservative person, or or even like, I don't know, like a hyper capitalist would understand that at a certain point, when you have too much inequality, capitalism fails because the people who need to buy the products in order to sustain the market don't have the money to buy the products. And this is like one of the contradictions in capitalism, but that like when we get to a point of too much inequality, this happens. And this is something that I think like I've seen conservative people that I know and follow like post memes recently that like a left-wing person would agree with, because we've got to a point where like there's almost like a universal truth that we need to do something because, you know, there's been inflation, there's, you know, hyper inequality, the billionaire club, like you know, that like Elon Musk's wealth, I know it's only like nominal, but like increased by 100 billion in 1 year during the pandemic. It's sort of getting to this level of extreme, and it's partly because we don't have a real grasp about how our understanding of technology related to capitalism, and how we sort of forget that Silicon Valley isn't some magical trick. It's like the same, it works the same as other stuff economically in this world. And we need to sort of think about this, but we always kind of want to pretend it's something different. But we've got to a point where I think actually economically, it's pretty clear that something needs to be done. And, you know, this is something that people even on the, you know, it might sound crazy to a left-wing person that a right-wing person agrees with them, but like I think this is, you know, borne out in terms of like what's really happening. But what happens is we have this sort of culture war type politics or party politics that's very oppositional, that basically it gets to a point where we almost don't want to do the hard work of recognizing the other as a person in which to we live in a community with. So politics really is not like party politics of like, I have this point of view and you don't have a right because I don't see you as a person and this is my right point of view. That's not really politics. That's sort of ideology slash like, you know, I don't know. It's not politics really is.
It's almost like fandom. It's almost like sports fandom.
That's a political theorist, Benjamin Studebaker, has made this point. Yeah. We have, at the moment, we have like fandom, people retreat to fandoms, families, and another F, but I can't remember. But yeah, politics has become fandom. But like actually politics, this is why you'll say your mum, well, you know, she didn't explicitly talk about her quote unquote party political beliefs, but she was extremely political because she recognized the existence of someone else's subjectivity. And as soon as you do that, you recognize that somebody has maybe a different set of desires to you. And as soon as you have two people with two different sets of desires, that's political, as in you have to work out how to navigate in a community resources and, you know, everything that we have in relation to other people. And so politics, and whenever we have like actual political movements, it's when people actually do the work of tarrying with, you know, all of these different issues to make change. And actually at times like this, when it seems like it's so impossible to make change, the funny thing is, it's if we were able to get to this point of getting beyond the sort of oppositional fandom type thing and get into like recognizing other people as legitimate people instead of saying you're a Nazi or you're a communist or you're, you know, basically saying your perspective, your desires, your way of seeing the world isn't legitimate, then we can't make a change. Which at the moment, I think a lot of people would like to across the political spectrum in terms of what's best for the majority of people. And a lot of the more toxic things that people, let's say, in terms of some forms of activism, you know, want to mitigate against are a result actually of the oppositional thinking. So the more like toxic and the more utopian, instead of like real world grounding, how do we make work and how do we actually do things, leads to scapegoating, which leads, because, okay, this is sort of like a relatively complex idea, but I actually think it's kind of quite easy to understand in some ways, in that we live in a complex and contradictory universe, as we said, in terms of like the Big Bang or whatever. But what happens when we have this idea of a perfect world out there, which might be some interpretations of heaven, unless we think of heaven in the nitty-gritty of interpersonal relationships and the nitty-gritty of the complexity of Earth. If we think that there's a sort of heaven in utopia, like a perfect world, and people think that this idea of heaven is just for religious people, that normal atheists, rational people don't believe in this way. They absolutely do. You know, people believe that their next pair of Nike trainers is going to make their life whole and complete. Like people have these utopian ideas in many different ways. And if you look, like a real example was obviously Nazi Germany, where there was this perfect utopian version of society that was imagined. But in reality, because we come from the Big Bang, there's no perfection. There is absolutely no perfection. So what starts to have to happen? So you can sustain this soothing idea, and often the worse things get for people in the real world, and the more difficult it is to make change in their lives, the more tempting it is to believe in this sort of toxic version of a imagined heaven on earth, or a utopia where everything will be perfect and sorted out. But what starts to happen is, because that's actually impossible in this complex and contradictory world where both light and dark exist, where precisely, you know, if we had everything we wanted, if we were sort of eternal human beings with no difficulty, nothing would happen. Like the world exists because of both yes and no, light and dark, on and off, and everything like that. So the more we sort of toxically pursue this utopia, the more we have to create well, there's two things that can happen. Either you start shooting yourself in the foot. So you see this sometimes with, maybe I've used this example before with Olympic athletes. There was an example of this Olympic athlete from Great Britain who was like the world record holder. I think it was in speed skating, and she'd won all the gold medals in the world championships. But when it came to the Olympics, which she'd really, you know, come to desire so intensely, that she had to get this gold medal, which really on paper would have been easy for her. in every single race she did in sequential Olympics, she crashed out, you know. And it's often, I mean, I can't speak for her life and her subjectivity, you know, but sometimes this happens. The more you desperately want something, the more you shoot yourself in the foot unconsciously, because if you were to ever get it, you'd realize it's just normal. It can't make you happy. It's not magic. There's no such thing as utopia. So that's one thing. Or the other thing is you create a scapegoat behind whom the shadow, they cast in shadow this utopia. And you're like, well, you can satisfy yourself by saying, if it wasn't for this group, then it would be perfect.
Right.
But the thing is, it's like to get to somewhere where we have a better society, which is fairer for people, which is more livable for people, you have to do the work of accepting there's no such thing as utopia, but there could be a form of heaven on earth that involves tarrying with the difficulties of encountering other people. And the more we sort of hold off perfection, and the more desperate we become, the more this sort of heavenly utopic kind of perfection starts to tempt us, then we start to have more and more enemies that sustain the illusion. But it's interesting, I mean, that sort of version of a kind of a perfect world on heaven is different from the heaven we're talking about, which is more maybe dialectical and messy. But also it's different from imagining that heaven is after earth, because you don't really need an enemy to sustain that, because I mean, it's almost the thing that sustains that is more the kind of unknowing. You know, we can't prove that there is a heaven after earth, so you don't need some sort of like monster in the way of that to create. But I think this is really where your mom was quite political.
Well, and she would say stuff, you know, like, I mean, she really knew, like, she you know, she knew what was going on. She knew what time it was in a way, because she would say stuff like, you know, God doesn't make any junk. And at the other time she would say, we're all made of the same old dirt. So she never saw life as perfection. She never thought life was perfect. She knew she would have to reconcile with enemies, that there were people, like, her heart would hurt when she was in a disagreement with someone, and she would go and she would try to make it right. Now, would she hang out with that person necessarily afterwards? No, but she would try to confront the issue and make it right. And it was kind of this idea of just realizing, like, we're all, I mean, this is the one thing. It's like, I remember when my friend, one of my best buddies and neighbors came out to me when I was a kid, and I came home crying, like, oh, my buddy's gay, Mom. Or I was crying, and she's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, my buddy, I'm trying not to say their name, but not that they would care. But so Steve's gay. I can't believe it. And she's like, or I just, you know, she's like, well, what's wrong with him? And I said, he's gay. And she's like, so he's still the same. He's still your friend, right? He's still the same person before. Like, you just got new information, you know, he's okay. And I thought, oh, I mean, she just disarmed it, you know. And it was like, I thought maybe she would be like, oh no, you know, like, I know she loves the gays, but I thought maybe she would be like, well, we love them, but we hate the sin. She didn't do that. She goes, he's still Stephen. And I'm like, oh, you're right. You know, and it's funny because a lot of my friends at the time were like, oh, I can't believe you're hanging out with this guy. And then, of course, 2 years later, they're all like, have gay roommates, and Madonna's got her sex book and everybody's celebrating, and it's great. You know, so the same people who are giving me a hard time for having a good buddy who was gay was now all of a sudden it was, you know, inclusive. But my mom kind of taught me that inclusiveness. And it was just kind of like, honey, life is messy. People are different, you know, and you kind of have to just live within that, you know. So yeah, you know, the Baptists are kind of legalistic, but their camp is kind of fun. So you should go to the camp. Just don't buy into all the mean stuff, you know. And it was very practical of like, how do we live together? Is that you just have to go through life loving people, but not loving people because they can create a better life, a better world for you, or that they agree with you, but that it's just easier to make it through life if you're able to accept that other people are different than you. And I think that's the problem we get, is everybody saying, accept me because I'm different. So you need to change, because, you know, rather than us all going like, okay, well, you don't agree with me, I don't agree with you. Let's just live life, you know, because this world is created for both of us, so we can live life and not agree on everything. And some people see that as compromise, but really, I mean, I think the root of the word of compromise is like co-promises. You just have to compromise. I think is good. I think it's important because we learn how to live. We, you know, that's how we reach peace, you know. and maybe not perfect peace, but you just got to learn to live life a little bit. And I think that's why she was just able to walk through these things, and if someone said something, like I can remember hearing conservatives saying something mean at the table, and my mom would be like, no, I don't agree with that. And I would always be like, huh. Because I remember earlier on, I was wondering, like, is my mom going to be, is she a people pleaser? And it was like she had her cake and ate it too. You know what I mean? She was able to go on and be like, no, I don't agree with that. To like someone who would say something bad about her gay brothers and sisters, or, like she had brothers and sisters who didn't believe in God anymore, who she loved dearly. And that wasn't, that just, those things weren't make or break. And it's like we've become so, the word for me would be legalistic in this society. I originally left the conservative church because I felt it was so legalistic. And I said, so I'm going to go to the progressive church because they're going to be, they're the answer, the liberal church, the mainline denomination. These guys have it figured out. And then you just realize, well, they're just legalistic about their shit too. They're just, and I just felt like my mom was just one of these people who just like, there's no room for legalism. You just kind of have to live life on life's terms. And what's funny is when I went in to get sober and joined the 12-step group, one of the main things about sobriety was learning to live life on life's terms. You can't change everything, and that's how you kind of find peace in sobriety. And it's almost in a way, you're just we're trying to get the world now to be sober. And I think the reason why we're having a Tammy Faye conversation is because we're just being like, how can we be more like Tammy Faye? That's why we're calling her a saint, because we're going like, how can we be like this? How can we be a little bit more tolerant of each other? And how can we learn to disagree in compassionate, loving ways? How can we care about our critics? This is why, why there's plays and films being made about her and documentaries, it's because people are going like, there was something here that was a little bit different. How do we touch that? How do we do that in our own lives? And sometimes I feel like it's an unconscious, it's almost like a weeping or wailing of our unconscious calling out for this, because I see like the people who make the films and stuff who are very one-sided politically and who think, well, these guys are the bad guys, but they're making this movie or they're making this play about this evangelical Christian woman who loved everybody. So there's almost like this calling out unconsciously in our art, which art really does beautifully, saying, how can we stop being so one-sided? How can we stop scapegoating each other? How can we be more like this? Because the world, talking about heaven, I mean, like, we don't know about heaven, but how can we make world a little bit less hell is by not continuously scapegoating one another and judging each other all the time. And it's like everybody's kind of saying, just stop judging me, It's crazy, right? And then what we do is we turn around and judge others, thinking that that's somehow going to keep them from judging us.
Yeah. Do you guys mind if
I turned it into a little mini sermon.
Dude, like, go, yeah, preach. So
go.
What do y'all think about this paraphrase? Like, maybe for Saint Tammy, heaven is not this fantasy of a place of no contradiction, Helen, which I know is an important word for you, and no conflict. It's actually a place of contradiction, but a space where we try to do conflict well.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's people say this all the time. I think Dylan Moran, I don't know if he said it first, he's an Irish comedian, but war isn't conflict, it's the inability to do conflict.
I love that.
It's true.
And I think this is something that's, but this is the sort of dialectical approach, right? And this is what Tammy was so good at in terms of the way she dealt with other people. It's like, to do conflict, like, something might be negative, but it's so easy for the human mind to resort to sort of resort to absolutes, especially in times of stress. And it's a really difficult time for people at the moment, and it has been for a long time. And life is difficult anyway before there are all sorts of other problems. But just because something is difficult or bad in terms of, like, you have to confront things that you don't like about somebody else in terms of conflict, like, conflict's not a positive word, but that doesn't mean it's like absolutely bad. It's like, in order to get to the positive, you have to sort of lean into the negative a little bit. You can't totality. So it's interesting, this idea of the totalitarian, right? So lots of theorists have talked about certain ideologies being totalitarian and you know, as in something is bad because something is bad because it is a total ideology. So Theodore Adorno was somebody who talked about the Nazis, in terms the Nazis come up along. I know that people use the word Nazi to sort of discount something that comes out of the mouth of something they don't agree with. So it's actually kind of annoying because you know, to sort of trivialize Nazism in that way, because actually if we look at that period in the 20th century in terms of the political conditions that led up to Nazism and also the structure of Nazism, there's a lot that's revealed in terms of, you know, what not to do, and it's obviously very tragic that people sort of throw it out in a way that leads us not to understand the full complexities of you know, in all kinds of dynamics and directions. I can't remember what I was talking about. I was talking about oh yeah, so there's
Adorno.
Adorno said, yeah, so the issue with Nazis is that it's a total ideology. But the irony is, the problem with Nazism and totalitarianism is precisely because the ideology isn't total enough, because in order to have something universal or to absorb everything, you have to absorb contradiction, you have to absorb the other, you have to absorb light and dark. And the thing is with Nazism, is a totalitarian ideology rather than a total ideology, because, which, you know, some theorists have said is the problem with it, because, but it's actually limiting. It's saying like, this is the group and that's the outside of it. And obviously there's generalizes and you know, there's generalization, but generalization happens within an inability to get to the total, and the total includes everything in the universe, including the unconscious contradiction, lack, light, dark, the other. And so it's ironic. So when people, so there's a contradiction in everything, right? So when you talk about totalitarianism, it sounds like it's a total ideology, but actually it's because it's a limiting ideology that it's generalizing. Generalizing never gets, which people think is a universal, an attempt to universalize or attempt to get to the total, absolutely isn't. Because the total, everything involves contradiction, lack, chaos, stuff you don't like, you know. I don't know. So it's just interesting that, like, conflict, it sounds like a negative word, but actually doing conflict allows us to not do something worse, which would be all-out war.
Yeah.
And conflict is basically argumentation, conversation, tarrying with different ideas and different desires, and trying to make out of that something work for everybody, given the circumstances of the world. But I was just thinking about what you were saying, Jay, in terms of your mum, that like maybe there's something in this idea of like, okay, heaven after earth is one thing, but what would it be like to imagine that this was heaven, that this is all there is? You know, that we live in such a way, as I say, that it's not just, this is, you know, confessional religious people and atheistic people who also have a tendency for religion, because we all do within our, it's the nature of our subjectivity, to attempt to sort of reach for perfection and utopian kind of worlds that don't exist. And it's like, well, imagine if right now is everything. Imagine, even though we know that, right, but we still don't know it because of the way we can trick ourselves. Because of our unconscious, we can have this sort of way, you know, different ways of relating to ourselves and sort of lying to ourselves and convincing ourselves that we believe one thing when we actually believe something else. But I think your mum was somebody, an example of this idea of kind of, imagine if this is it. Imagine if this is the heaven that God gives you right now, and there's nothing else. How does that affect the way that you live your life?
That's one of the interesting things is because, like, I feel like my father always either lived in the past or was living in the future to reclaim something, you know, like, oh, we got to get it, or we got to get the glory back, or we lived in the glory days, or when I was in prison, you know, that kind of thing. And my mom, this was like a huge difference between them. And probably what affected their marriage a little bit is that my mom wanted to live in the moment. You know, she was so alive, and life is what's happening right now, you know. And I saw that in her, you know. I saw her fight against that need to live in the past, or the need to feel bad and sit and lick your wounds. And I'm unfortunately, I live in the past a lot, you know, but I find freedom in the fact when I accept things as they are, you know. And she was able to kind of live in that, accepting things like, this is life. This is just how life, this is how it's playing out. And I think there's something really great about that. I mean, that's why when she passed away, I didn't see her body, you know, because it was like, she was life to me. Like the last time I saw her, you know, she rubbed her face against my beard and laughed and talked about it being tickly and all this stuff. And but it was like, that was her to me. It was that life, it was that interaction, it was the touch, it was the feel, it was the humor, it was the sweetness, it was the depth, it was the contradictions that I knew she had in her. You know, all of that was just that, you know, like the beginning of the world, you know, the light and the dark coming together. She was like that. She was that contradiction and that conflict all right there in front of me. And so I knew, like, that's who she was. She was just this living in those moments. And I feel like I wish we could, because I hate this idea of, like, you know, you had Trump with, like, let's make America great again. You know, like, well, when was it that great? You know what I mean? And then you have everybody going into this utopia idea. Well, if we just did this, or if this was just legal, or if this was just illegal, things would be great. You know, you know, we're not. And so we just kind of dream and never focus on, like, hey, let's be in this moment for now. And let's embrace the conflict so we can eventually get somewhere, but let's live this life a little bit. Yes. And I feel like there's not a lot of living within the time that we're in. And so we're so like 10 steps ahead that it just seems like in reality, in 10 steps, we're just going to still be fighting, because we're not doing anything in the moment to say, well, let's just learn to live and let live.
But this is, you know, when you talk about acceptance, this isn't to say that you should accept how bad things are, right? It's like acceptance is more to do with acknowledgement. So because a lot of people, I mean, it's a human tendency to protect yourself against the horrors of life, to live life as you imagine it to be, not as it really is. And often confronting where you actually are, accepting it or acknowledging it, is the most difficult step. So, you know, there's things like climate change, right? It seems like this issue goes on and on and on, but like, have people, I mean, maybe that's a bad example, but there's lots of examples where it's sort of, where things are so bad that you can't acknowledge how bad they are. But until you acknowledge them and accept that up until this point they have been this bad, you can't change them. And this is obviously the logic of the 12 steps. You have step 0, where first of all you accept you're accepted, which is very difficult for humans to do in this sort of perfectionistic world, in this world where we don't get much recognition from wider society, because recognition is dependent on achievement and money and you know, social media, and we need a basic amount of recognition just to exist, you know, to feel like we are humans in the eyes of other people. This is why psychoanalysis works. You sit down and you see yourself in the eyes of somebody listening to you. But also there's other dynamics of psychoanalysis that are operating at that, you know, within it. But like, we need to be able to really, you know, often when people are really stressed about something, the irony is they haven't got stressed enough, you know, they haven't really ripped off the band-aid to see how bad something actually is, and then entered into accepting that at this point, this is where I'm at and this is where we are at, and we can now change it. So, and, you know, as I say, like, human subjectivity is really difficult, and we often don't even have the tools to acknowledge what the problem is, you know, or have the time to sit down and think. We can sometimes say, well, this symptom is the problem, but it's just a symptom, and actually there's something deeper going on that's created the symptom. We can get so fixated with the symptom, but not actually take the time to get back to what the root cause is. So acceptance isn't just about, oh, everything's fine, la-di-da, get on with it. It's actually the opposite of that. It's in acceptance. And again, this is the dialectical thing, like with your mum, in, you know, that it's you know, you run to the raw, right? So like, in acceptance is very, very difficult, but it's only in acceptance that things can actually change. So, and often we're in pursuit so much of change that we don't get to the point of understanding what we need to change to do the change, you know. So this is what I think step 0 is, the 12 steps is very philosophically insightful.
Well, I mean, I just did a talk on Paul Tillich's talk, You Are Accepted. And the whole point of his thing is like, you're accepted. That doesn't mean you're going to believe more, or you're going to believe that God is Jesus, or this is that, or you're going to do more, or you're going to think more. You're just accepted where you're at. But really, I mean, that the power behind that is when you realize, oh, I'm accepted, it does give you the abilities. Like all of a sudden there's like a pressure taken off. You know, my whole, like growing up for so many years of my life, I thought God was a record keeper. Oh, Jay's doing this. Oh, Jay's drinking. Oh, Jay's touching himself. Oh, Jay's had a lustful thought. You know,
touching himself, is he?
Oh man, hey, I got to hear more about that.
That was a really bad one. I was going to hell. I only did that once, guys. It was an itch.
Oh yeah,
got it.
but the idea is that, like, to be, you know, to all of a sudden realize like God loves you no matter what, was for me at 21 a mind-boggling idea. You know, at 21, even though I had been in ministry for over a couple of years. And it's only when that happened is where I was like, oh, I can get sober, because I'm not trying to get sober for God. I'm not trying to get sober for my parents. I'm trying to get sober for me so I can have a better life. You know what I mean? So I can live life more true to me. And so I can face some of the issues that I have, you know, and the more I go like, well, I've got to be me, I'm able to, like, recently when I was out of town and visiting a friend, he was upset with me for something I wasn't doing and blah, blah, blah. And he sat down and confronted me about it. And he was like, why are you so calm? You should be mad at me, blah, blah, blah. And it was just like the idea of going like, no, I'm trying to learn about how to be a better me. And if I don't see it and someone points out something that I realize I'm not doing, or I'm maybe not doing correctly, and there's a better way, I want to hear that. You know what I mean? And so there's something about that kind of grace of it used to be like, for me, it used to be like when someone would say, well, you've done that really awful. And I'm like, you're right. I'm a big piece of shit. You're right. You know, I'm horrible. And it wasn't confronting it. It was just internalizing it. Like, oh, that's part of why I'm not accepted. But now, like, going like, well, I'm accepted. I'm okay with myself. I can learn more. I can grow more. It's like this freedom to be, you know, and face conflicts in a different way that don't feel like personal attacks all of a sudden. You know, it becomes more about the freedom to grow personally. I don't know if this will make sense, but like cleaning my house, sometimes I get so overwhelmed by the house. Oh, it's so dirty. I can't do, oh my God, I can't. Oh, it's just too much. So I ended up watching Netflix. Nothing gets clean, you know. But then there's that moment of going like, well, you know, how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. Okay, so just move some stuff, pick some stuff. Don't get overwhelmed. Just do what you can right now. And then it's like, oh, this isn't so bad. It isn't all the fear and horrible things that I've created in my mind. And so I think there's just something about that, being able to be still, to be in the moment, that doesn't, you know, go like, well, I just accept the way things are and that they're shit. It just gives you the freedom to go like, well, I don't accept the way things are, but I also know that Rome wasn't built in a day, you know? And so I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to do the white one bite at a time. I mean, it sounds very much like I'm a therapist, like just one bite at a time, to go do, you know, but those things kind of do work. And a lot of that comes from me seeing a psychoanalyst and discovering who I am inside and what my unconscious is doing and things like that. And I feel like my mom really had a lot of that, not perfect all the time, but kind of that, you know, that accepting things the way they were. Still, she wanted to see the world to be a better place. Still, she wanted to let everybody know that Jesus loved them, you know, still, but she was just like, we got to realize this stuff before we can do any of the other stuff. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just like, in order to do that stuff, these are you know, we have to know we're loved and accepted. And I think that's what gave her the ability to do the work that she did at, you know, when she was with my dad on PTL and doing the, you know, Steve Peters interview, you know, gay pastor with AIDS, you know, when the Assemblies of God would have, you know, she was Assemblies of God, were like totally against that. She did it because she just knew that it's about acceptance. It's not about theology. It's not about how we're going to change or what we're going to do. It's about accepting the moment that we're in. Or, oh, penile implants. Like, oh, guess what? Christian men like to have sex, and when they have erectile dysfunction, they can't. And this is something that needs to be. You know, I mean, it was just saying like, we've got to learn to live life and make the changes we need to make. And I think that's kind of a cool, healthy way to be.
Yeah, I like that. So I had a question for the two of you. I don't know if this is more your realm, Helen. Are there any ways that you see, like, even the secular world that would maybe oppose itself to kind of religion pursuing like their version of heaven? And one of the things I think about is like the contemporary digital, futuristic kind of appeal of, even some of the TV shows I've been watching, Black Mirror, and there's a show on Amazon, Upload, where it talks about heaven as like consciousness, being sent into the cloud. And there's these spaces where there's supposed to be no conflict and it's perfect, but you quickly realize that it's a type of hell, right? Where all this horrible shit happens.
It's funny that like so many of the tech companies have this sort of like, especially for like Apple, Garden of Eden, the Apple, and there's sort of like religious connotations in the cloud and everything. I think like Chat GPT, I mean, maybe it's controversial to say, but I'm like I'm like an AI naysayer, like not like a tech naysayer. I think technology is really important and really good and really positive, but I think this utopian vision of what AI can do, I think, and also at the same time, this dystopian vision, right? This kind of like hell, as in like not just normal hell, as in like it's a like Chat GPT is annoying. It's just dumb, right? It produces essays at the level of sort of like barely a pass at undergrad. If you do a poem, it's like a really shit 12-year-old's poem. It doesn't have, because AI doesn't have the contradiction of subjectivity. So subjectivity, what makes humans be able to create art, is having an unconscious, right? It's like the thing that isn't, it's the mismatch between 1 and 2. It's like the cut across reality that allows for, so if you were just a hyper rational robot, you'd be like meh, 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 meh. You wouldn't be able to create that which generates poetry, that which generates, like, it touches on the profound. And when we see like when we see AI generated, you can tell it's from an AI. Like, and the funny thing is, the joke about it, the thing that people use it for, is to show how shit it is. Like it can do nearly the human thing, which is, it can produce like an essay or something, but it can't give it that which makes it human. And again, like that essence of being human is necessary for us to recognize the other person and to be recognized by the other person. But it's also what makes the human dangerous. But the thing that makes a human dangerous is also the bit that is the possibility of making it not dangerous. So a political theorist friend of mine talks often about like the military and the role that the military has. So obviously, like, the military is seen as sort of tied to in the past, like, expansionist states, and tied to like the downside of capitalism, and is sort of like a global police force to ensure that the more powerful nations have access to the resources, at the expense of less powerful nations, which is true. But then also there's an aspect in it where, when we have humans as police officers, humans as military people, there is the possibility for change in society, because there's always the possibility of a human not pulling a trigger. If you look at something like the Paris Commune in 1871, like, part of the reason it was successful was because the soldiers joined the people. There's always this possibility. This is like you have like the rose in like left-wing politics, whatever, that you can put a flower in the end of a gun and not shoot it. I mean, like, so there's always this possibility when it's a human that the absolute, obviously, humans are capable of terrible, terrible, terrible things. But the thing that's actually really scary about, I think, AI and tech is the replacing of humans as police officers, as border control, as military, with robots, like sort of things that will just kill, because there's no discernment there. There's no possibility of a decision being made by the person on the other end of the gun to not shoot. There's no possibility. And, so obviously now we have drones, which has taken that human possibility within the military, so the revolutionary possibility, a step back, because the person is desensitized. They're like playing a video game or whatever. But then there's a step further back where you have like an AI robot that is going on like just pure digital command. And that's what is really scary about AI. But the funny thing is I don't think that the scary thing that I think people think is scary in AI is that, it'll be able to think for itself. No, because things that don't have an unconscious can't think. And it's the unthinking, the not being able to change or to discern that is the danger. And what worries me in AI is not that like, oh God, we're going to have these like sentient beings that are more clever than us. And this is a really complex kind of idea, but it's basically to do with the nature of how human subjectivity is formed and how we're marked by the unconscious. And it's the unconscious, it's the impossibility within subjectivity that allows us to speak and think, which robots don't have because they're completely binary. It's the like disjuncture in human subjectivity that lets us think. So what worries me about AI is not the intelligence, but the lack of intelligence and the lack of discernment. And yes, you can critique the military in many ways, you know, for what has been done to people all around the world at the hands of the military and in various guises. But human soldiers being replaced by robots is what really worries me. Because then there's no chance of revolution. There's no, and even if you're not on the side of revolution, maybe you're a conservative person, but you want, that always has to be the threat of revolution for things to be positive on the side of the majority of people, whether, you know, wherever you come from in the political spectrum, even if, you know, you're not on the side of actually things being carried out, you know, towards a kind of revolution or whatever, but like that potential. So taking that potential away is like, that's what keeps, well, I don't know if it keeps me up at night, but that's what I think about.
It's going to keep me up at night now. Thank you.
Sorry.
So what do you guys think? And I know for the two of
we
you,
need RoboCop.
Yeah.
We don't need RoboCop.
No, RoboCop's half man, half machine.
Okay,
there you go.
Then we do. Sorry, I've never seen RoboCop. We don't need robot cops, but we need
RoboCop.
We need RoboCop.
Yeah.
So I know the two of you aren't the biggest fans of Carl Jung, but I think he does have a quote that actually brings in what Helen's been talking about and even the concept of heaven. And I just want to see if you think Saint Tammy would resonate with this. At one point, he said, "You can't have your branches in heaven if you don't also have your roots in hell." And I'm wondering if that resonates at all with the two of you and maybe how Saint Tammy would think about that.
Well, I think she would love that. You know, I mean, Jung is really good at quotes. I'll give him that. I really like his quotes.
Whether he actually wrote them or not, we're not always sure, but yeah.
You know, like sometimes I'm like, oh, it was Jung. Oh, well, okay.
No, but you know, I like, especially early Jung, I think is really fantastic. Yeah. But Freud did sort of have a bit of a go at him after he sort of became more into sort of mystical kind of things. But there's a lot of really good stuff in Jung, definitely.
And I think my mom would have like hung out, like really liked him because she had the fun spiritual side too. You know, oh, honey, tell me more. You know, Freud might have been a little bit clinical for her. I don't know. I love Freud, but you know, I also like clinical stuff, and also it just works with the way my brain works. You know, I mean, she loved like that. I remember who said the quote, "We like when you're going through, you know, when you're going through hell, don't stop." You know, and I think it was one of your Englishmen who said that. But yeah, she loved stuff like that.
Churchill,
you know, don't let
Churchill, right?
Yeah, it was Churchill who said that. Yes, it was Churchill. And you know, and her thing was like, when you're going through hell, don't stop and grab as many people as you can. You know, come on, honey, we're going through hell. You know, don't let the bastards get you down. But at the same time, she loved the bastards. You know what I mean? So there was always a contradiction there. It's like, and so she was saying that don't let the bastards get you down. She was also telling that to the bastards, like don't let the other bastards. You know what I mean? It was like this kind of inclusion that was really interesting. And, you know, I remember she used to sing the song, "You Can Make It, You Can Make It." And I heard her once say this, and I used it a few times later in my own work. She says, like, we used to say you can make it from faith. You know, we used to preach you can make it from faith. And she's like, now we do it from experience. You know, and I think that's the same concept of that. Like, you know, you've got to have your roots in hell if you want to have your what is it? Your branches in heaven. You know, it's that kind of same thing. It's like, we've been through hell and we've made it through hell, you know.
I love that.
And she was saying that, you know, for her, it wasn't like, there was never the good old days. Like she realizes like those were good, but now we've survived through it. And, it doesn't have to, be what it was in order for us to have the branches to be in heaven. You know what I mean? So it was kind of that concept of, you can make it, and I have made it, and here's a woman who, she's had a tough life. She really had a really tough life. And at the same time, always, found a way to, like when I sent you that thing the other day where I said, eat dessert first, because, life's too short, eat dessert first. That's what she used to say. And she used to go to Marie Callender's and order pie first, and that was the idea, was even finding those moments of like, even in like dinner, and just, and to me, it was kind of a form of anarchy. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to have my pie first because I'm going to enjoy life, and because I want to make sure there's enough room for the pie, and so there was just like, but in some ways that was the clear confession of life is hard. Life is often trying to get your dinner, so have dessert first and then live life. So I kind of really always appreciated that about my mom, is that she was a survivor, and she ran to the roar, and she went through the hell, and she didn't stop. And, like that last moment of her life, not a lot of people were happy that she went on Larry King the last day she was alive. And the weird thing was when she passed away, a lot of people said, oh, did she kill herself? And she just wanted to go on TV. And then she didn't believe in that. That was something she would have never done. But she showed people her complete fragileness, which I was shocked. And like, she was, she wore makeup because she wanted to look pretty. And here she was, her makeup couldn't cover up the fact that she was at death's door. And she still went in her last breaths, letting people know that God loved them and that she had hope. I mean, moments before she died, and that you can make it. And what was interesting to me, and I think we could probably end with this, is that like when Larry King, I'm pretty sure was, I think atheist, or at least agnostics, said, Tammy Faye has passed away. He announced that my mom had died to the world, basically. And he said, and tonight she's in the arms of her loving God.
Wow.
And so I think that says something. And I think it says something so powerful that it doesn't even need comment. Yeah.
Amen to that. Well, guys, it's been great connecting with you and talking about St. Tammy, and hopefully we can do it again in a couple of weeks.
Definitely.
Sounds great.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Peace.